What I'm going to try and do this afternoon is not so much present a formal paper, although, as you've mentioned, there is a formal paper. What I want to do is go through the set of slides and then talk about some of the background to my actual arriving at this point where I decided to speak about God's honoring of the marginalized. So you'll forgive me for a somewhat relaxed presentation, but I think you will find that you will learn something, not just about the Psalms and about the poor, but I think you may also learn something about how to do research. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that right in the beginning. So we'll go on to the first slide. William Loader asked the question in 2013, what happened to the good news for the poor? And I love that question because the Bible, as Isaiah says, as Jesus says, is about good news for the poor. And we need to ask ourselves, is our church, is our parish, are we being good news for the poor? Because that's what God calls for us. He calls on us to bring good news to the poor. All right, next slide. In this paper, I look at 7 or 8 Psalms. I explain why there is a difference, where there's a common theme, namely God's gracious defense of the honor of specific vulnerable groups of the community named in these Psalms. And the defense may be described as a reversal, so I'm giving away the end of the paper, a reversal of their shame and a recognition of their God-given honor. Next slide. There are 2 marvelous writings on the 8 Beatitudes, 8 or 9 Beatitudes in Matthew's Gospel, Matthew chapter 5, and they're well worth reading. And I'm going to start with Jerome Nere's Honor and Shame in the Gospel of Matthew, honoring the dishonored. What Jerome suggests is that rather than saying happy are the poor, happy are the hungry, rather to say honored are, and then you set all of those beatitudes, macarisms as he calls them, following the Greek, in the context of the values of first century. In other words, shame and honor. And he deals only with the first 3 beatitudes. He deals with the poor in spirit. He deals with those who mourn. And he deals, I've just got to follow my little notes. He deals with the third one, the meek. Powell suggests that, in fact, we should also include the 4th one, namely the hunger, those that hunger. And if you read the Beatitudes, and I've just given you the kind of the snippet version, the first speaks about the poor in spirit. Then we read about those who mourn, and poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of God. Those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. The meek will inherit the earth, and blessed are those who hunger and thirst after righteousness, for they will be satisfied. So there we are, 4 groups. And why are they distinctive? Powell suggests these are the needy, the people who are in need of help from God. So the poor in spirit, which I understand, and more recently there's been some support of this view, means those who are poor both physically and in their self-esteem. So they've been robbed of their self-esteem by whatever's happened in their life, or they've struggled financially. So the poor, those who mourn, And bearing in mind that many of the people that mourned in first century Palestine were mourning as a result of Roman aggression. We read about the meek, which in the Hebrew, rather than, and I'm going to come look at this in more detail when we get to that psalm, can also mean the poor or the afflicted. And then those that hunger and thirst for righteousness. That's what you'll get if you are reading the Protestant version of the Beatitudes. But from 1611, ever since King James. But if you happen to be reading the Catholic version, produced 2 years before that, 1609, the Domeris, you will find it's blessed are those who hunger and thirst for justice. And the Greek word can be either justice or righteousness. And I think it's really interesting. For the last 400 years, the Protestants have been chasing after righteousness, and the Catholics have been chasing after justice. I'll leave that to your imagination as to how much humor I've injected in there. All right. And then what Powell suggests is the other categories, the pure in heart, the peacemakers, those who are persecuted, constitute the righteous. And they are the ones, according to Powell, who are responsible to meeting the needs of the people in the first 4 Beatitudes. And I like that idea. The other thing is in Jerome's honor and shame is he suggests very strongly, and he argues for this, that we should speak of God honoring these people. And again, who does the honoring? That is the righteous. So that's the kind of background, and that's the notion of divine reversal. The idea put forward by Jerome Nere that God honors, God lifts up those who are oppressed and broken and downtrodden, and he honors them. Next slide. In 1981, Bruce Molina, who I've met on several occasions, especially when he came out to South Africa to speak about his commentary on Revelation. Lovely guy, and I've got a lot of time for him. He produced almost a New Testament changing perspective, the New Testament world, insights from cultural anthropology. And he swept everyone away with this amazing understanding, particularly of shame and honor and how it operated in the first century. And I got very excited about it and wrote several articles using Bruce Molina's writings. But then I realized to do good scholarship, we need to read the sources of your sources. What sources did Bruce Molina use in his understanding, in his reconstruction of shame and honor, which he then applies to first century Christianity? And I discovered something very interesting. Molina's sources are cultural anthropologists, that's good, who conducted studies of the late 19th century and early 20th century Mediterranean villages. That's really, really good. But as I looked at these studies, I realized, wait a minute, these little villages that these cultural anthropologists were looking at are Christian. At least some of them are. Some of them are Muslim. So what we get is the 19th and early 20th century understanding of shame and honor through the eyes of a Greek Orthodox person or a Russian Orthodox person or a Muslim. And then that composite understanding, that reconstructed understanding, is fed back into a first century context and says, this is how Jesus and his disciples would have understood shame and honor. And I thought, that can't be. That's not a fair equation. You are taking back Greek Orthodox understanding, and specifically of men and women, into the first century. So I wrote a few more rebellious honor and shame articles, and I didn't get much reaction from the New Testament. But then when I wrote applying that, because it also, shame and honor, being carried just as it was Russian Orthodox, etc., into the Old Testament. And that was where I started to get some response to what I wrote. Next slide. I wrote in 1995 a little article called Wise Women and Foolish Men. And that, of course, was deliberate to create a reaction, shame and honor in Proverbs. And that article was the one that was picked up by different scholars around the world. And then I got support for this idea of raising questions about that simple transportation from 19th century peasant communities into at least the Old Testament. One of the people who was very positive about what I said was Joanna Stibert, in her work, her PhD on University of Glasgow, and her PhD spoke about Jeremiah. And she called me, and I was rather struck by this. She called me a lone voice and running contrary to the flow of the time. But she then spent the next 6 pages saying why I was right. And that was a marvelous thing to do, because often we write and we publish our articles, but we don't often get a response, certainly not a detailed response like this. And you suddenly feel, okay, so maybe somebody's actually reading the stuff that I put out there. And that was so encouraging for me. And then I discovered her professor was Robert Carroll. And Robert and I have had a wonderful relationship, because he passed away, over the years as we've prompted the thinking of each other. So I then realized how Joanna had stumbled across my writings. Next slide. SATS is much more familiar with David De Silva, and he's spoken often on SATS programs. He's got an article on honor and shame in the Dictionary of Old Testament wisdom, poetry, and writings. And he also responded to my article on Proverbs, and he supported me. He did raise some issues and said, I don't agree with everything that Domeris says, but I certainly agree with the basic principles. So I'm saying that. Now that all started because I did some research into the sources of the sources. So I'm flagging that for you who are doing original research. Just go that one step further. Don't just pick up the sources, but read the original sources. Then into what I really want to talk about is honor. And in David's work, he writes, honor refers to the experience of being esteemed by one's group or other social entities on the basis of embodying that which is deemed desirable, virtuous, and socially productive. Next slide. Crystal, who wrote in a response and he's an anthropologist. Crystal wrote a response to what he was reading about shame and honor among biblical scholars, and that you could find in Samaya, 1994. And it's quite a good critique of the shame honor as it is practiced by biblical scholars. So I highly recommend picking that up, reading it. And he said, "You can be dishonorable in the eyes of your fellow men, yet honorable in the sight of God." And that's what I kept seeing as I read through the selected Psalms that I'd chosen. And De Silva writes, God's honor is also presented as being in jeopardy when the honor or safety of a person who has been visibly aligned with God is endangered. So in other words, the righteous. As in Psalm 143, verse 11, "For the sake of your name, O Lord, revive me." All right, so we know God's honor is also part of the big picture. Next slide. There are 7, in fact, there are 8, but I'm going to explain why we've got that 7, 8. Exhibit an honor-shame reversal, whereby those not normally considered to be honored are unexpectedly accorded the bequest of honor, as with the Macarisms, as with the Beatitudes. This is solely the grace of God and not in response to some innate goodness in the people. In other words, I'm saying, got to be very careful about assuming that God helps particular members of the poor or oppressed. I'm suggesting rather God helps the poor and oppressed, including those who are righteous. And you could ask questions about that afterwards. Each of the Psalms treated here, there are 2 groups. And this is how I chose the 7, 8 Psalms. There are the antagonists, which is the enemy, the wicked, and the protagonists, the vulnerable. Next slide. And these 2 groups are juxtaposed against each other. And in addition, there is an appeal for God's intervention. And God, as I say, is the prime actor. And what God does is he gives honor by means of some action, a gift of land, defeat of the wicked, or a reversal of shame. So the wicked or the unjust are shamed. The first psalm that I want to look at is in fact 2 psalms together, Psalm 9 and Psalm 10. But you read them as one. And how do we know we should read them as one? Because they both are acrostic psalms. That wouldn't help much. That just means, the first verse starts with Aleph, and then the next with a Beit, and so on through the Hebrew alphabet. But what happens is at the end of verse 9, we're halfway through the Hebrew alphabet. And when we start verse 10, there is the rest of the Hebrew alphabet. So the 2 psalms are to be read as one psalm, and I treat them as one psalm. The antagonists are the wicked, the nations, the oppressors, the enemies, those who hate me. So there's a personalization there. The greedy and evildoers. So plenty of baddies in the story. Next slide. Those in need, and there's quite a lot of them. There are the poor, the needy, and the innocent. And next slide. The oppressed, the helpless, the afflicted, and the fatherless. So a whole category of people who are vulnerable or in need. I'm going to just do a little diversion here. A number of years ago, back in the 1990s, when I just moved from UCT to WITS, I was invited to take part in a project for a dictionary on Hebrew words. And I was invited to choose a category. And so I chose the poor and the oppressed. And it eventually ended up in this rather marvelous book. Well, in fact, there's 5 of them. the Dictionary of Old Testament Theology and Exegesis, where I've written all the words for the poor and all the words for the oppressed, and they gave me the rich and a few others as well. So when I talk about the poor and the oppressed, I talk about it on the basis of having to produce these articles for, as I said, for this theological dictionary. I've never had to write at that level of scholarship. You feel like you've been pushed and pushed again, and then they'll read it through and make some suggestions. And so it's a marvelous way of really sharing your scholarship, but also digging really deep into your understanding of what these different words mean. And you think, now people are going to be using this maybe 20, 30 years time. Students, I need to do right at the absolute best that I can produce. All that to say, there's lots of vulnerable people here. Psalm 34 has, and I'm just going to take the one line, their faces shall never be ashamed. Their faces shall never be ashamed. God is saying of these people, or the psalmist is writing this message from God, their faces shall never be ashamed. Golding Gay says there are three parallel imperatives addressed to the Anavim, the afflicted, namely to look to God, to let their faces shine, and not let their faces be ashamed. Psalm 37 is a psalm that speaks about the inheritance of land. And the key verse, I'll just go through. Lofink in TDOT suggests it is possible that the psalm refers specifically to the peasantry who face increasing class difference and were in danger of having their lands, losing their land to great landowners. And the key verse is verse 11. The Masoretic text, in my opinion, should be rendered as, but the afflicted or the poor will possess the land and delight themselves in abundant prosperity. In other words, God is saying, I'm going to turn this around. Those, as he says in that first beatitude, blessed are the poor in spirit, for to them belong the kingdom of God. The Psalm 74, again, let not the oppressed return dishonored, or let the afflicted, but rather let the afflicted and needy praise your name. So God is reversing the present state of dishonor so that God's name will be honored in the process. Next slide. Psalm 82 takes place in quite a different context. It's the angels meeting together in God's divine council. But it has the same juxtaposition of aggressors. In this case, it's the angelic judges for their faulty judgments. And in the process, the psalm honors those who have been shamed, verses 3 and 4, namely the poor, the fatherless, the destitute, the afflicted, and the needy, or Evion. Psalm 113 is one of the most beautiful psalms you can read. It's almost a prophecy of the coming of Jesus. And it says, Yahweh, who is great among the exalted powers of heaven, chooses to humble himself to be present with the poor. That's my version of it. He raises the poor from the dust. He lifts the needy from the ash heap. He makes them sit with princes, the princes of his people. He makes the barren woman abide as the happy mother of children. So there you are, lovely reversal of the state. And it's prayed for proleptically. In other words, it's prayed for in anticipation that God will honor this request. The last psalm is Psalm 146, where it speaks in verse 7 about God executing justice, giving food, setting free, opening the eyes of people, raising up and loving people. He preserves and he safeguards people. Wonderful prayer of God working for those who are in need. So, who is meant to respond to the cry of the poor? Terrain observes affinity between justice and love in the psalm. So there's a clear call for both justice and for love. And Estes writes, out of Yahweh's love comes his justice on behalf of all those who are wronged. But this justice, and this is the crunch, requires the cooperation of humankind. And I think that's if that's the message I want to leave with this paper, and ultimately with the published version, is out of Yahweh's love comes his justice on behalf of all those who are wronged. But this justice requires the cooperation of humankind, and I would add, especially those who are seen to be righteous. Next slide. And this is all done. And I'm going to sum up with this, by the grace of God. There's no merit given to these people. Okay, occasionally they are designated the righteous, but many times they are not. There's no inherent merit there that demands God's grace. This is God's free grace given, poured out to those who are in need. Last slide. Sorry, next slide. Thank you. I'll conclude with some words from Plains in his social vision of the Hebrew Bible. If only in a slightly rhetorical sense, the Psalms preserve for us the universal cry of the poor. And he goes on to say, in this sense, then, the Psalms continue to hold out poverty and justice as key issues for their community and any group that seeks to take the Psalm Psalter to frame its liturgical life. So I'll leave you with that little challenge there, and thank you for listening.